Hello, everyone, and welcome to my live. My name is Mark Turi, and thank you so much for being here. If you are here today live, which I see my friend Shell is here. Shell, just want to say hello. I hope you're doing well, and please let me know in the chat if you are, what you've been doing the past little while. I hope work has been good, and I hope everything's been good and safe and fine. It's obviously the fall, so I can imagine maybe the summer holiday spin, so to speak, has probably settled down a little bit. But I'm sure you're doing well and hope you are. I think maybe the weather in Florida, let me know how it is, because I know in the summer it's hot and humid and then kind of gets rainy in the fall. So hopefully everything's been going okay on your end. As always, like I like to say, if you have not already and you're watching this on the replay, please like and subscribe to my like this video, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And if you have any comments about this presentation, in the end, please post them either here live, especially if you have any questions regarding the topic today, and also, if you have any comments afterwards, please put them in the comment section. And as always, sometimes when we talk about relatively controversial topics, such as politics, now we're more getting into political philosophy and political history, the history of politics and political movements, intellectual history. But obviously, sometimes they're very um, sensitive to some people. Just again, just be respectful, ask questions, and I'll do the best to to give you answers. If not, I can do the best to help you find the best resources. Clearwater Chad is in the house. Hey, Clearwater Chad. I um I got to get to Buffalo, my friend, one day, so we can eat Jersey Mike's, Buffalo Wild Wings, and all that kind of stuff. Uh, that corner that I sent you on, that particular corner where all those stores are, that I sent you in our little group chat there, that's, one of my favorite corners in the Buffalo area. It has quite a few shops that I have enjoyed frequenting, Target, Barnes& and Noble, and so on. So, I would like to get back to there. Hello, Irish Mart. Thank you all for being here. That's amazing. Thank you for your support. I saw Irish Mart earlier on Marilyn's stream. She had a really great stream a couple hours ago, so that was amazing. And I'm gonna probably be talking to Marilyn and Brian Lucas, I believe his name is Brian Lucas from A Poet, who's in Arkansas. I'm gonna do a stream with him on Sunday, I think, but keep details open for that. Um, and I just wanted to again go through and talk a little bit about what's been going on in the past couple days. Nothing too serious or anything, but if you've been keeping up with my last stream, I mentioned that there had been a lot of flooding on the Danube, and that certain parts of the Danube, such as ferry ticket counters or ticket, what do you want to call them? I guess ticket box offices or whatever, ticket offices, I should say, and certain, I guess, ports, if you want to call them that, or where river cruises kind of unload, had been totally like completely flooded, and also tram tracks had been flooded, and pedestrian crossings that are underneath the tram tracks to go from one side to the next were completely flooded. But thankfully, several parts of the public transportation were opened today, so it seems like the the river is going to get back to normal, the water level, and hopefully within the next couple of days, the trams that run up and down that are closest to the river will be fully opened, because usually there's about a gap of 3 or 4 stops from a particular place to right around the parliament that are absolutely closed because of flooding. And then there's also on the other side, the Buddhist side, which has been closed due to flooding. So I hope by at least the weekend, so within tomorrow, the next day, the day after, they will be opened again. But thankfully, even though it was a really bad flood, one of the things that sort of affected this was some prices of some foods and stuff because obviously where Budapest is, we can get flights and there's a lot of highways and stuff, but there are still a lot of products and goods that do come by the river. And there are often freighters that are specifically designed for the river. So they're not ocean freighters like you see, for example, in certain parts of New York City, or you might see them in Copenhagen, or even like, places in England and stuff like that. Even in Canada, where I am, because Toronto connects to what's called the St. Lawrence River, which then connects to the Atlantic. So there's these big honking massive freighter ships, and those are like big cargo freighters. But there are river freighters, which are smaller in height but longer as well. And I see them every once in a while, especially if I go north on the Danube. You will see these freighters, and no freighters, no cruise ships have been able to go through. So that has kind of disturbed some produce and some things and products that have, come from places like Germany and Austria, and some of them go all the way to, through Serbia and stuff like this. So the Danube is quite a big, important river for trade. It has been for, I guess, since people have been around, and at least since we've had boats. So when it gets disrupted, not just in Hungary, but in Austria and Germany, and then it goes through to Belgrade, and it goes even through and dumps out at the Black Sea through what's called the Danube River Delta, which is a crossing between Moldova, Romania, and Ukraine. So that's quite substantial. But again, thankfully, everything has been kind of back to normal. The weather itself was a very nice 20 degrees Celsius. I want to say that's again mid 70s, low 70s. If you're in America for Fahrenheit, it was nice. It was sunny. So little gray, little overcast today, but otherwise pretty good. And again, the weather and the Danube itself is sort of moving forward. I actually went somewhere today to a shopping mall, and it's a little bit hard to navigate some unless you really know what you're doing. We have an amazing regional bus system here in Hungary, but it's a little hard to navigate if you've never taken it before, if you don't speak Hungarian. So I met two couples, two married couples, older, probably in their 60s, 70s, from Denmark, and two friends, female friends, one from Turkey and one from Portugal. And between myself and the six other people, I helped them guide how to get from the shopping center back to Budapest, and then showed them where to go on public transportation. And I had to apologize on behalf of all the Hungarians because they said when they approach the transport, information people, they're not really that friendly. And I just said, I guess maybe they don't speak English, or they don't want to speak English, or they don't like tourists. Unfortunately, it happens even here. But I was very happy, to guide these people back to where they needed to be. So maybe I'll become a tour guide or something in the future. I guess I could be, you know, as I am looking, for careers in the future. So maybe that's one thing I can do. But I thought it was very interesting. So tonight, what we're going to talk about is a topic that I thought would be very interesting because I guess a week or two ago we talked about different aspects of history, different schools of thought, and I did mention Karl Marx. Quite obviously, a controversial figure. Um, for many different reasons, which I agree with in a lot of ways. Sometimes misused, but I would say for the most part, the controversy is noted and maybe warranted in some degree. But I talked a lot about his views on history, which of course is that history is kind of inevitable, it's chronological, and it's going to lead somewhere. And that somewhere is to a revolution, which he predicted would take place in industrialized Europe, probably Germany, maybe England, France, but somewhere in the industrialized Europe. And then it would take hold, and of course, it would move into the stage of socialism and then communism. And of course, socialism was class consciousness and awareness when the bourgeoisie or the property owners would no longer hold the means of production. And then eventually there'd be some stateless, classless society, which he called communism. So Karl Marx was, born on the 5th of May, 1818, and his first big publication was in 1848 when he was around 30. And that was a pamphlet which you can buy, download very easily called the Communist Manifesto, which is really a rallying cry and an introduction to his ideas. Things like, all of history is a class struggle and the revolution and the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, but it is a pamphlet. So most of his works are contained in Das Kapital, which is a 4-volume series. Marx only published the first volume. His friend would end up subsequently publishing the volumes 2, 3, and 4. His friend, of course, Friedrich Engels, which I'll talk about in a moment. But when Karl Marx was 30, in this year in 1848 is what's referred to as the Spring of Revolutions. So around March of 1848, there were a number of revolutions going on in Europe in about 17 different cities, from as far west as Paris, as far east as Bucharest, as far north as Berlin, and as far south as Palermo. It was a big revolution, and it was not communist and it was not socialist. It was more of a democratic, liberal, and constitutional based revolution. And one of the reasons why that was is because there still was a lot of absolute monarchies in certain states, Austria, Germany, France, etc. And this was part of uh, the lower class, especially men, protesting for equal rights. And of course, one of the demands of the lower class men was what's called universal male suffrage. And universal male suffrage is the idea that before this time, if you were a man who owned property, you could vote. But if you were a man who didn't own property, were a peasant or a farmer, didn't have much money, you couldn't vote. And of course, it's always good to note that, sometimes human rights are quote unquote trickle down to other people. So we are neglecting women. In this case, women, of course, would not get the right to vote in many well known established countries until the late 19th century, early 20th century. Of course, the French Revolution did give women the tennis court. I forgot the name of that, the tennis court Congress. And there were these little things that did go on with women, especially in French Revolution and even in Russia and stuff like this. But mainly in England and the United States, Canada, it unfortunately wouldn't be until the early 20th century when women would get the right to vote. And then, of course, U.S. has the civil rights movement, and there's still a lot of voter suppression going on. So while it's not perfect, one of the demands was for non-property owning men to vote. So why I'm mentioning this is, again, and I mentioned this a few times, I will do a PowerPoint on nationalism in Europe in the 19th century and the spring of nations because it's incredibly fascinating. But this is the year that the Communist Manifesto is printed and distributed as a pamphlet. There's not a lot of evidence that suggests that the reasons why the revolution happened was because of the Communist Manifesto, because ideologically there were differences. But this is a pretty significant event for someone who's saying that there's going to be a revolution and it's going to be in Europe and it's going to be catastrophic and it's going to be very progressive. Unfortunately for Karl Marx, um, the revolution didn't come. And he even got pretty excited in 1871 when, for about 2 months, there was something called the Paris Commune, which I'm not exactly terribly well versed on, but I know that it was like a socialist experiment in the city of Paris, which eventually was settled after what was called the Franco-Prussian War, which led to the disabling of this 2 month and a week or something commune, and also the unification of Germany by Bismarck by 1871. So Karl Marx dies on the 14th of March in 1883. And at this time, there was no revolution. His friend, of course, the German Friedrich Engels, is born on the 28th November, 1820, and he dies. Him and Marx died in London, by the way, in the 5th of August, 1895, just 2 years later. And in those 2 years that you know Karl Marx had died in again 1893, Friedrich Engels dies in 1895. Friedrich Engels had published Das Kapitals volumes 2, 3, and 4. But again, by 1895, there had really been no revolution. So the title of this um, presentation is what happened when the revolution didn't happen. And that's exactly sort of the next step, because now what I've sort of been going and talking about is what is referred to as orthodox Marxism. There are not that many people, despite what you might hear from certain American uh, commentators and political politicians. I don't want to mention any names, but you might know whom if I'm talking about. There are not a lot of Marxists in the United States. There might be some on some college campuses teaching Marxist economics, history, sociology, but there really is not much. There's not many. And in fact, there was a gentleman who passed away 80s, 90s. His name was Eric Hobsbawm, and he was referred to as the last Marxist in Cambridge. So, and he actually wrote a number of very interesting books, but on nationalism and the psychology of it. But there really is not many, and if there are, they're usually not orthodox Marxists. So then it becomes like, okay, you have this guy Marx, you have his friend Engels. They're basically saying the revolution is going to come. It's inevitable, right? History is chronological. And I mentioned chronology of history before, inevitability, irreversible. The working class is going to see that their conditions and the factories and so on are so abhorrent that they are going to rise up and they're going to seize control of the means of production and start this, you know, the workers owned factories and so forth. Well, as years and years go on, as Karl Marx, dies, there are other philosophers who contribute to differences. And I'm going to look at three dichotomies or three sort of one versus another type of thing tonight. We're going to get into what's called revolution versus reform. So there are a number of people who would be considered Marxists, communists, socialists, and anarchists who believe very strongly in revolution, but only some of them believe in reform. So what does that mean? And we're going to look at different interpretations of revolution as far as Lenin was concerned and as far as the anarchists were concerned. It's then going to overlap when we talk about, do we use violence or nonviolence? And then the last one I want to talk about is, are we going to use like a one state party, essentially an authoritarian state, or are we going to still have democracy? And all of this is going to overlap with each other. So, another gentleman who's very interesting, his name was Mikhail Bakunin, and he was a Russian philosopher who is one of the founders of anarchism. He was born in Russia in the 30th of May, 1814, and died in Switzerland at the 1st of July, 1876. So he died almost a decade and three quarters of a decade before Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And anarchism, of course, when we think of anarchism and anarchy, we think of chaos on the streets, we think of riots, we think of hooligans, we think of vandalism and so forth. But you have to remember that that's kind of a colloquial term. That's anarchy. When we're talking about anarchism, we are specifically talking about a political philosophy. Now, by the way, the political philosophy of anarchism could lead to those things because anarchism is the idea of having no state. So, no state at all, and usually no authorities. So, whereas most of us would say, yes, that will lead to violence and anarchy, anarchists kind of think that it would actually lead to more peace, and it would actually lead to a place where there would be no, they would say, no gods, no masters, where individuals would have essentially freedom to do what they want. Now, how could we run a society? How we could run a community? They have their own thoughts on that. And there are different types of anarchism, which I will get into later. I'm actually going to briefly use the website Philosophy Basics, which I have 4 links in this description of this video that will go through all of the different types. So I'm not going to go run through every single one of them because it'll take 3 hours, and obviously we don't have time. So that's why I'm going with the bigger ideas, the more macro ideas. But I am going to go through a little bit before we end on the main types, okay, of anarchism and how they differ. But Mikhail Bakunin and many of his Russian anarchist um, people did believe in revolution. So, what would an anarchist revolution look like, right? Well, it would probably be, in some cases, violent, or at least if there was violence, it would be morally okay because the ends justify the means. And so, after Mikhail Bakunin, there becomes a philosophy known as Anarcho-Communism. And this is the most anarchistic and most far left, extreme far left version of non-state or libertarian communism. So it sees first that there must be a revolution. Instead of waiting for the revolution, the revolutionaries are going to force themselves into taking control over the means of production. So they're not waiting around. This is not an inevitable thing. This is action. This is going to happen. They're going to get together and make it happen. They're going to fight the police and so forth, and they're going to seize the means of production, which essentially in the 19th century meant factories. Today it can mean factories, banks, farms, hospitals, etc., but it really meant factories back then. And in doing so, they are going to make a stateless society. They're going to force a stateless society, even if violence needs to be put into place. And so, obviously, Karl Marx, I think violence was almost second to him. I mean, there definitely is a violent part of him, but there's also more philosophical parts of him too, which is a weird dichotomy. Because one of the things I don't like about a lot of these philosophies, left, right, or center, and I hope this is not a controversial statement, is that any idea that needs violence in order to obtain its means and its ends, to me, is morally objectionable. I hope I'm not alone on that, but you never know. We are on the internet. So we could probably find trolls and people who might say otherwise, that it is a means to an end and it is justified. I don't think so. That's my opinion, obviously, and I think I use the word moral in that sense, and I don't think violence, um, unless it's for self-defense, is moral, but that's my objection. And so that's certainly one codified movement that really starts to take place in a very odd place, which is in Russia, where they have a group called the Nihilists, not to be confused with Nietzsche's nihilist. There's actually an anarchist group towards the later part, like towards like the 1880s, 1890s, early 20th century in Russia called the Nihilists. And then in addition to that, there were the Decembrist Revolution. So these are all going on very, very late into the 19th century. But then we get, of course, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who is born on the 22nd of of April in 1870. So he obviously misses a lot of Karl Marx in the you know communist revolution. But he's still alive when Karl Marx is alive. I don't think they ever met or anything, but he was in Russia, and it's very famously that Lenin, pardon me, had a an older brother who I believe was a communist, if I'm not mistaken, from what I've learned. And I want to say it was around 1895. Someone can fact check for me that he was killed by Tsarist police in a protest. And this is his older brother who he looked up to very, very much, and it turned his life to being a revolutionary from that point on, and really, really seeking the destruction of the czarist state. And of course, as we know, by 1922, the Soviet Union is born, and Lenin plays a massive role in the October 1917 revolution. He's the leader of the Bolsheviks, and he's able to take power. He's able to defeat the Mensheviks as well as the Whites, which of course were a number of people fighting the Russian Civil War, including Canadians and Americans and other allied forces at the time. So by 1922, he establishes the Soviet Union, and then he dies on the 21st of January, 1924. But one of the most interesting things about this is, again, Lenin read Marx, just like a lot of these individuals did, and Lenin creates something that becomes known as Leninism, which then evolves into Marxism-Leninism. There's a number of different particular important points on that, but the real important point in what we're talking about today has to do with revolution. So again, revolution is not coming. Revolution is not going to come to Germany, France, or England, or so forth. It's also very bizarre to many communists and people who were in the socialist movement in 1917, when Russians and in Russia there was a communist revolution, because Russia at the time was still feudal. They still had serfdom. They really didn't have a lot of industrial advantages in their economy. Okay. They were still quite, quote unquote, backward technologically and economically. So this goes right beyond people's heads because, of course, the 1848 revolution does happen in Paris and Berlin. For example, it happens also in Budapest and Austria and so on. These are technologically more advanced cities, also in Italy. Rome had a revolution, Palermo had a revolution, etc. Then we have the Paris Commune, which is, well, it's in Paris. It's a highly industrialized place. So if you're Karl Marx, you're thinking, oh, I guess the revolution's coming soon. And it's going to come because it's going to come in an industrialized nation. But Lenin flips everything on its head. One of the things that Lenin starts to think about is that, again, we can't wait for the revolution. It's something we just can't wait. The consequences are dire. People are suffering, and there really needs to be this revolution. So the main point, there are others, but the main point that I want to take from this today is something that's known as the vanguard party. So in Marxism-Leninism, there is this idea that the revolution must be stimulated. Okay, it must be instigated. So it's not something that we're just going to hope is going to happen in the future. We can make it today, and we can make it quite soon. So how do we do that? We create what's called a vanguard party. We hire people that are called professional revolutionaries. It is their job to go into institutions, factories, and so forth, places of unions, businesses, and to literally teach the factory workers, farmers, teachers, railway conductors, train operators, you know, what what is the revolution? So in a future date, they will then all organize and within their institutions, within their businesses, their farms, etc., the revolution will be created on a grassroots movement. So this is what the vanguard party is. Now you can look at that as most people do and say that's extremely pragmatic. And in fact, if we're going to judge objectively the differences between Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, we could say that Karl Marx is extremely idealistic. It's a lot of hopes, it's a lot of futures, it's a lot of we're going to wait and hope, right? But this is one of the most pragmatic parts of revolution is if you can stimulate the revolution from the bottom up. Just go in to a factory, look at the foreman, sit them down, say, "This is the revolution. This, you're now working for labor. You've got black lung. Children are working here. You're working 12, 15 hours a day. You don't have any time off. So here's what the revolution is. You give some literature, some pamphlets, spread it around to your factory workers, and when the party contacts you, you're going to rise up." So it's almost a very sneaky, covert type of revolution. And again, very pragmatic. I mean, we can have my thoughts and opinions about this because, again, violence is part of this in some ways, but putting that aside and just looking at a practical application, Marxism-Leninism is probably the most, you know, practical, way more practical than Orthodox Marxism. So those are just two ideas. There are other forms, but I want to move now on to reform. So when we go and make this sort of broad, review of revolution, we have Orthodox Marxism. Again, the revolution is inevitable. We have to wait for it. It's going to happen in an industrialized country or industrial nation of Europe specifically, but we don't know when. Anarchists say, let's get together, let's fight, let's do it, and let's create a stateless society and like do it now and be, very, very radical on top of things. And then Marxism-Leninism, which is like we must do it from the bottom up, and we must have these professional revolutionaries and this vanguard party to stimulate the revolution upwards. So that's just different types. Do we wait for the revolution, or do we make it happen, or do we make it happen from the bottom up? But now we're going to get into reform. As you can imagine, all of these events are happening between 1848 and the Russian Revolution and even into the early 1920s. And one thing that many socialists, especially, and I'm going to get into these terms in a moment, are looking at what's going on in all of these places, and they are very disillusioned with the violence because the Russian Revolution was extremely violent, right? The Tsar and his family murdered in the basement out there in Russia. This idea of violence. So a lot of people got really tired of waiting, and they thought that revolution was not only never going to come, but if we could have a reform movement, if the getting rid of the revolution part, if we could just have socialism as an economic system. And the definition of socialism as an economic system is to have public ownership of the means of production. That's in contrast to capitalism, which of course is private ownership of the means of production. And Marxism, communism, anarchism, while it does have an economic system that is defined by socialism, not all socialists, for example, are communists or Marxists or anarchists. So in the Reformed age, which really starts around World War One, even a little bit before, even the very early 20th century, we get in Russia and we also get in Germany what's called the Social Democratic Party. So almost right away, by the late 19th and early 20th century, there is this split between the revolution and the reform. So the German Social Democratic Party, which still exists today, the Russian Social Democratic Party, which I don't know if it exists today, believed that if they were going to achieve the aims of Marxism and communism, whatever, they would remove the revolutionary and violent aspects and they would use the system as is to make incrementalist changes that had nothing to do with violence and sort of use the system that was already in place, like the parliament. So if you think about it, right, a revolution doesn't want to have anything to do with the system. They want to overthrow the system. But if you're a party that's in parliament, then you can pass labor laws, labor protection laws. You can pass laws that protect children, that give us a weekend and a minimum wage. And some of those things in Germany had happened under Bismarck. And around the 1870s and 80s, Bismarck was the first, and Bismarck's Germany was the first country to give nationalized insurance for on-the-job accidents, as well as universal health care and other kind of social reforms. Because even though Bismarck was very much a conservative, he gave these things to sort of make the communists and socialists in the later half of the 19th century at bay. And that's really where these parties, you know, come out of, is this idea that we have a parliament. Let's go to the parliament. Let's get in and let's start implementing policies in a small stage. And then the original goal, and I want to make this very clear, that the original goal of social democracy 100 plus years ago is very different than today, because what happened was there was a split. There's always splits and schisms in left wing politics. In the 1920s, there then starts to become another term called democratic socialism. If you live in the United States or Canada or many of the English speaking world, democratic socialism and social democracy is often overlaps and they're often used colloquially. Like when somebody says the word socialism in the United States, they don't mean communism or Marxism. They don't mean the economics of the government nationalizing everything, public ownership of the means of production. They usually envision something like Sweden, which has higher taxes, very, very good, robust social reforms and social welfare programs, free healthcare, maybe free universal child care, so forth, right? Maybe free public transportation, and so on. And again, a massive redistribution of income. That, though, in Europe, where I live, is referred to as social democracy, and it is not a form of socialism, it's actually a form of capitalism. So even though I'm talking about the German Social Democratic Party and the Russian Social Democratic Party from 120 years ago, yes, they believed if they were going to institute some more Marxist and communist ideas, it had to be more reform. By at least the 1920s, and especially after the Second World War, there's this division. So I know that Bernie Sanders in America used to say, although I haven't heard him say this in years, is he would talk about progressive politics, the New Deal. He would talk about the welfare state, universal health care, and he would call that democratic socialism. But over on this side of the pond, that's social democracy and that's capitalism. It's progressive capitalism. And you can read it, many books about the Nordic model, which is a very good model, I think, for those countries. Obviously, I would hope that the United States one day does get universal health care in some of these programs. But you know, that might also just be wishful thinking, although I hope for many people's sake they do. Maybe it will come incrementally, but I would hope so. Because of course in Canada, whereas our universal healthcare system is not perfect and we have ungodly wait times, we have universal healthcare. It's pretty good quality. So I think there's some misinformation sometimes that goes on in the US. There's obviously criticisms that can be valid as well, but we have to take both of those things. So the next is like, what actually is democratic socialism? So this is the schism now. So under the reform, the no revolution, there are people who believe in democratic socialism. So the social democrats become so reformed that they and so what they call revisionist that at least by the end of World War II, when Scandinavia and many of the Western world is developing what's called the Keynesian model of economics and welfare states like Canada, in some part the United States, but mostly throughout Western Europe, they become so reformed that they no longer are socialists. And today they're no longer social democracy is really not socialism. But if you are a democratic socialist, as per, let's call it the dictionary definition, and this is a definition from Wikipedia, supports political democracy and some form of social ownership with a particular emphasis on economic democracy, which I'll get into in a moment, workplace democracy, and worker self management. So I might have said this before. I may have said this before on this on my lives. But again, when I was a kid, I spent some time in Yugoslavia, and in Yugoslavia, they had another reformist type of socialism, which is connected to democratic socialism. It's called market socialism. And how I like to explain market socialism is that in a society, in an economy right now, whether you live, let's just say you live in a Western Europe or North American type of, country, you'll have grocery stores. You'll have Walmarts, you'll have Woolworths, Wegmans, Loblaws, and all this kind of thing, right? Spar, so forth. Those are owned by private companies. They're owned by corporations, right? They have a board and so forth, but they're privately owned because they're owned by individuals. They might be publicly traded or privately traded, but essentially they are corporations. If you're in a market socialist economy, there are no private corporations. Um, those private corporations don't exist because there's socialism. So instead, every supermarket or market or bank or you know provider of goods and services are instead of owned by individuals and corporations and companies, they're owned by the workers. So if there's 10 workers that work at a small market that sells some produce and some milk and some meat and whatever, those 10 workers own an equal stake in that commonwealth or in that co-op. Let me just say hi to Black Boots. How are you, Black Boots? I hope you're doing well today. If you want to watch on the replay, no problem. I'm glad you're here. Thank you so much for your support. I really appreciate it. Thank you very, very much. It's good to see, always good to see friends and regulars on here. So thank you. So in democratic socialism, there's sort of a parallel between that. Your market socialists are going to focus more on certain things than democratic socialists. But the idea being that all the workers in a shop that provides a good or services equally own that shop, and in some cases, they'll earn like whatever the gross income is at the end of the day, whether somebody worked an hour or 8 hours. In some cases, they'll take, I don't know, let's say the 10 people in this one shop have a gross net income of $1,000. Everybody gets $100, whether they work an hour or not, or if they work 8 hours, because there's no rent, right? Because the government owns the property, the company doesn't. So there'd be no rent, there'd be no overhead, there'd be no utilities, very utopian. Where democratic socialism tends to go a step further is this idea of like worker management and democratizing the workplace. Because even in some co-ops, there might be an elected leader who's the leader of the co-op or the commonwealth is kind of a broad term, who might actually have to step in because they're still using market principles. Like they're not considered a boss, but they might consider someone who's going to allocate different things. Whereas, like in democratic socialism, there wouldn't be that. There'd be no bosses. Okay. So it goes a little step further. It also believes in the democratization of the means of production, which means distribution and the receiving of goods and services is democratized. So that means if more than 50% say that things should go to a particular group of people or area, if more than 50% say yes, then it goes there. So it's not market socialism, it's not based on market principles, it's based on democracy principles, a direct democracy principles. Now, again, whether or not we believe this or not, I definitely am a critic of this. I think that can be really kind of bad if some people want something in a community, but they're voted 51 to 49 that they don't get the thing they want or need, you know, and I'm not a socialist for that reason, but I do like some ideas in market socialism. And certainly some of those things might work in the future and they might help overcome some of the things that are going on in the US where people are working hours, so many hours, so they're more than one job and they're making minimum wage, which is not high enough. So I guess I'm sort of maybe social democrat ish. I don't really like to be too political, but if I'm just strictly saying in terms of economics, that might be like the furthest type of left wing economics that I would go theoretically. Again, politically, I'm different. I don't really want to, get into politics as I'm a little more to the liberal part. But regardless, I still see the benefits and what are the benefits, and of course the negatives and what are the negatives. Okay. So that's again to sum up the whole idea of reform is okay, we're not going to have a revolution. Revolution's not going to happen, but we have a parliament system, we have a presidential system, we have a party system. So we're going to create a communist party, a socialist party, a social democratic party. And when we get power, when we get seats in the parliament or the Senate or the House of Commons or whatever, there are policies, pro labor policies, redistribution policies, creating government programs. And we've seen that a lot, after World War II and especially after World War One. The laws that were passed to give factory owners and so forth, collective bargaining rights, um, the weekend, the 5-day work week, the minimum wage. These are things that many socialists have given our society. In some cases, not always. Henry Ford started to give his workers weekends and like 8-day work weeks before it was law. So even some people in the private sector were experimenting, but of course, it is because of unions and so forth that it went universal, which is a good thing. Universal healthcare, of course, companies were giving, universal health or healthcare, I should say, to their workers, but then the government stepped in to give healthcare to everyone else. And in Canada, where I'm from, universal healthcare was first instituted in the province of Saskatchewan only to soldiers that had come back after World War II. And then from 1945 to about 1965, in the 20-year period, after that, it was given to all of us getting some kind of benefit. And of course, there's Medicare in the US and Medicaid in the US, which I believe comes out of the 1970s and 60s, Great Society, Lyndon Johnson, and so forth. So, if I'm not mistaken. But those things are definitely more inspired and very positively inspired by a more reformist movement. Now, when we get to violence or nonviolence, I have touched on this. So I'm going to be brief and then we're going to get into one party state or democracy. But when it comes to violence, it is possible to have a nonviolent revolution. There are definitely people who are even anarchists, communists, socialists who would still believe in a revolution, but would still want a peaceful one. And what that could mean is a revolution of culture, or a revolution of society or something like this, you know? Cultural revolution. Mao was a cultural revolution, which was extremely violent, but there was a cultural revolution in the US in the 60s, which for the most part was peaceful. I understand the Vietnam War was going on at the time, which was obviously horrifically tragic for the Vietnamese and for the Americans. But the idea just being that you can still maybe have a peaceful revolution. And in fact, I'm going to give, I think in the next couple weeks or two after next Saturday, I'm going to talk about the German Revolution and the German Civil War from 1918 to 1919. I'm going to talk about a young woman named Rosa Luxemburg who dreamed of a communist revolution that was peaceful. And we're going to get into some of her thoughts because she left a lot of writings for us. When it comes to reform, generally speaking, it's a lot more peaceful. But there are still people who can, walk that line between reform and violence, although it's generally not always the same. When we think of revolution, we primarily think more of violence or overthrowing, but there are people who aren't that way. When we think of reform, we generally think of more peaceful democratic means, but of course, there would still be people who would say, like, no, we have to actually use some kind of violence to get into parliament, or let's just say illegal dealings because the ends justify the means. So they might walk the moral, what's that word called? They might be more morally nebulous in that case. But the last one is still a question that's going on, and still is a question for many of those on the left who come out of this, socialist, communist, anarchist, Marxist. Is once once you have a revolution, once in some cases a state is created, does it kind of go by way of the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Cuba, China, North Korea, Vietnam, which are called one party states? Or is it possible to have more of a democratic, type of system? One of the reasons why there are authoritarian states that are usually led by communist states is because their end goal is that they've had a revolution, they've created a state, the state has one party, and the one party is going to implement, in some cases, policies that then get them towards that final goal. So it's kind of like taking that Leninist, pragmatic, vanguard kind of idea and then extending it, right? Because there's still an end goal. The end goal of Leninism is still Marxism. It's still communism. It's still, having a communist state, which is usually stateless as well as classless. Now, the criticism on that is if we look at places like China, they have what might be called state capitalism as their economy. And places like the Soviet Union, North Korea have had, generally speaking, a centrally planned economy, which, as well as in Yugoslavia, even though they were marketed, they still had periods of nationalization and collectivization of farms, which didn't really go so well, especially with the famine in the 20s that Stalin created against the Ukrainians, called I believe it's the Homolodor, forgive me. But it's also considered a genocide because the state came in, took all the grain out of Ukraine, and many people starved and had to leave their homes, and created a Ukrainian diaspora. Many people left for Canada, for example, and the U.S. So there is that idea that there has to be this one party state, that there can't be dissent. Because if you have democracy, if even if you have a socialist type of democracy, right, or a social democracy or a democratic socialist state, what ends up happening is counter revolution. And that's one thing I want to bring up as well, is that you will have conservative parties come in and do complete role reversals of your policies, which happened with people like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. Because after 1945 to roughly 77, and in America 1980, was there were a lot of very progressive policies, even with Republicans, like even, you know, don't like him, but Nixon, who started the EPA and created trade with China during that time. Even some of them went along with that sort of welfare state type policies. But then what is called neoliberalism comes in and privatizes a ton of institutions, mental health institutions, healthcare institutions, labor busts, and so forth. And so many of the one party state people will say, under a democratic system, you're going to have dissent, and you kind of have to control that dissent if we're going to go forward into this communist system. The democratic aspect of this is that democracy is just better. And you know what? If in a 4-year period, someone who's in a right wing um, party comes in and privatizes, well, then we're just going to have to win the next election, and we're going to have to reverse those. So it goes to kind of a back and forth, like a game of tennis, where the left wing policy comes in, redistributes wealth, raises taxes, creates more programs, supports labor unions, etc., gives more money to teachers, increases public schooling, kind of, kind of uh, um, dissuades private schools and private institutions. But then the right wing government comes in, reverses that. Then the left wing government comes in and reverses that. And it's a game of tennis. Obviously, I prefer democracy to authoritarianism for many different reasons. Each have a trade off. Because, yes, if you are in a one party state, the dictator or the autocrat can just make policies. The obviously downside is no one's elected, there's no accountability, and power tends to corrupt, but absolute power corrupts absolutely, which is a quote by Lord Byron, the poet, and from 1902 or something. Whereas in a democracy, okay, you might have to deal with the opposition, who privatize, but at least you're picking your leaders, and at least, you can help spread ideas and still make change. Because even in democracy, things like the civil rights movement happened, and so on. So that's really these dichotomies between what happened when the revolution didn't happen. Now, there's an idea that I have, which is not shared by everybody, which is that I do believe that Marx's revolution happened, and I believe that it was the Russian Revolution. And I believe that even though Karl Marx said the revolution would happen in a place like Germany, England, or France, and even though it would happen organically, I think that the Russian Revolution was the closest that we will ever get to Marxist's version of the revolution. And so it has happened. And in my opinion, it did not create a better society. It created men like Stalin. And even though we can get into the post-Stalin era, even Brezhnev in 1956 condemned. He gave a speech in the 50s, maybe it wasn't exactly 56, although I think it was, condemning Stalin and Stalinism. And going forward, they had glasnost and all these different economic reforms. We had here in Hungary goulash communism, which implemented more market socialist policies. So it was no longer as authoritarian or as totalitarian. You know, the ends don't justify the means. And so I still think that the revolution came. It came in the place that Marx didn't predict, but it came anyways. And it was the Russian Revolution. Now, what I want to do before I close this out is to go over just a couple of different versions of different ideas of Marxism, Communism, Anarchism, and Socialism. And then I will talk about what we're going to talk about on Saturday, which I hope is a good thing. But even before I do that, I just want to read to you um, the definition of social democracy as per Wikipedia definition. So, social democracy is a political, social, and economic philosophy. It says within socialism. I would just add it's historically within socialism, but in modern times it's within capitalism. That's just my edit. That supports political and economic democracy and a gradualist, reformist, and democratic approach towards achieving socialism. Again, that's historical, but in modern practice, social democracy has become mainly capitalist, with the state regulating the economy in the form of welfare capitalism, economic interventionism, partial public ownership, a robust welfare state, policies promoting social equality, and a more equitable distribution of income. So the first half of that is very much the historical 100 years ago. It's like a form of socialism, it's incrementalist, but it breaks off into democratic socialism, which I mentioned before. And today it's a form of capitalism. If you want to know a little bit more, there is a book called Progressive Capitalism by American economist Joseph Stiglitz. It's an amazing book. It's a little bit old now. It's from like 2010, 12, but it's a really good one. So when it comes to Marxism, I'm just going to run off a couple things, which is some very brief ideas, and then again we'll go to the closing of this one out. But we have classical Marxism, as I mentioned, orthodox Marxism, and that's again the theories of Marx and Engels, which we've been through. We talked about Leninism, as I said, it's um, in competition with Stalinism, it's the vanguard party. They talk about libertarian Marxism. It says it's a less authoritarian view. So it's not Stalinism, Maoism, it's just a little bit different. It emphasizes the ability of the working class to forge their own destiny. Okay. There's structural Marxism, which is based on the theories of a French philosopher named Louis Althusser. And it says here, it's what does it say here? Um, led him to realize that it provides not only a model of economy but also a description for the structure and deployment of development of society. It was popular in France in the 60s and 70s. We have neo-Marxism, which sometimes is also a term you hear a lot on the internet, but neo-Marxism is really just a psychological term. It says it incorporates Marxism with modern psychology, sociology. It rejects economic determinism, and it believes in a non-physical psychological revolution. It also talks about the Frankfurt School. Cultural Marxism is another thing, dog whistles on the right, but it's essentially Marxism that has critiques of art and media and film. There's post-Marxism, which is social theorists who have later built on additional theories to classical Marxism, which go beyond regular Marxism. There's Marxist humanism, which was talks about structural concepts of society. There's Marxist feminism, which of course talks about women and equality and so forth. And so those are sort of the main doctrines. And socialism, I mentioned democratic socialism. Revolutionary socialism, again, is just this idea again of having social change through revolution, sometimes called the Third International, was sort of founded by the Russian Revolution. There's also Trotskyism, which is incorporated into that. There's utopian socialism. Karl Marx believed that he was doing science, which is another thing, and that everyone that did socialism before him did utopian socialism, which wasn't scientific based. There's libertarian socialism, which essentially is an idea. It says production, information, and so forth would sort of be achieved through the would be anti-authoritarian. It would be very community based and union based. So some of those market social principles are in there. Then of course there's market socialism, like I went through. There's eco-socialism, which is pretty self-explanatory, environmentalism and socialism. And then there's many forms of religious socialism, including Christian socialism, Buddhist socialism, Jewish socialism, Hindu socialism, and so forth. When it comes to communism, again, just basically here Marxism, there's Leninism, there's Marxism-Leninism, which I mentioned before, Stalinism, again, the views of Stalin. There's Trotsky, which he argued for the establishment of the Vanguard Party. He was, of course, executed. There's Luxemburgism. This is Rosa Luxemburg and her ideas, which I'm going to get into in later time. Maoism, of course, has to do with cultural revolutions, social revolutions, which many of you may know about from China. There's left communism, there's council communism, anarcho-communism, religious communism, and then finally types of anarchism, including philosophical anarchism, individual anarchism or libertarian anarchism. There's mutualism, there's free market anarchism, there's also agorism, social anarchism, collectivist anarchism, and I could go on and on and on for days, but let me just go back here. Anarcho-syndicalism, religious anarchism, and so forth. So there's a lot of stuff that I encourage you all to go to Philosophy Basics and to look up more if you would like. So just before I close out our live today, and I want to thank again everyone who listened to me talk. I want to thank everyone who popped on here. I saw we had quite a few people on. We have about 4 on now. And especially shout out to Chad, to Irish Mart, to Shell, to Black Boots, to anyone else who's watching this on the replay. If you haven't and you like what I'm talking about and you like my content, please like this video. Please subscribe to my channel. I am trying to get up to the 500 subscribers. I'm at 85 right now. I'd like to get more. I will hopefully be appearing with From a Poet as well as Marilyn in the next week or so. And I still would like to go on more shows as well to get more subscribers. So please, again, comment, please subscribe and like. And so I just wanted to talk about what we're going to do on Saturday. On Saturday, I usually stream again the same time, which is at 3 p.m. on the Canadian US Eastern time zone, so 3 in the afternoon. And we're going to talk about, I'm going to do a PowerPoint. I have a pretty big PowerPoint on what's going to be referred to as the Jewish ethnic divisions and religious movements in the past and present. So we're going to talk about the Second Temple era and the movements within that era. We're going to talk about things like rabbinical Judaism, who are the Ashkenazi Jews, and the different ethnic lines, to which there are 3. And then in Judaism, we have movements that are sometimes called denominations, but they're a little bit different. And we also have 6 of them, at least in the Ashkenazi world. So we have 3 major ones and 3 minor ones. And I'm going to go through and give you the basics of a lot of different stuff, a lot of Jewish history, both ancient and modern. And yeah, I hope it's a lot. That's going to be an 18-slide PowerPoint, which I'm very proud of. And again, we're going to go all the way, talk about the temples and the temple areas and the different groups. We're going to talk about rabbinical Judaism, what that means. We're going to talk about the ethnic divisions and where people migrated to and what languages they spoke, which I think will be very interesting. We're going to look at the ethnic makeup of the Jewish people in some respect, and then I'm going to get through the kind of the theological differences, interpretations of the Torah and law in all those different 6 denominations. So I want to say thank you again so much for everyone who listened to me. This was actually one that I didn't think I would have a lot of things to say. Sometimes that happens because I'm thinking, even before I got started, I'm like, man, is this only going to be a half an hour? And look what happened. It's an hour 10. So for those who are still listening, thank you so much. I mean, I really appreciate it. It's really just fantastic that people are here. Thank you, Chad. Thank you very much, Shell. I know you're on quite a bit. So thank you again. Sending you more memes this week. Look out for those. Irish Mart, again, a pleasure to see you earlier, and Marilyn's chat. Hope you guys can make some of my regulars, and you all can make Saturday. If you can't, if you can watch on the replay, that's fantastic. But as always, give this video a like if you enjoyed it. If you want to comment on anything that I said, if maybe you thought I was wrong on something, gave a wrong date, or have additional information, please drop a comment. Ask questions if you'd like. Be respectful. I'll, definitely look at it and respond the best that I can. Please look at philosophybasics.com. It's a very brief, overview where you can get into a little bit more nitty gritty on the different types of those ideas. And I do also want to say eventually in the future, I'll do kind of a right wing. We'll talk about right wing philosophies because why not? The only reason we're talking about this today is because I mentioned the Marxist school of history. So I don't want to negate anyone else's point of views. If you're left wing, center wing, right wing, as long as you don't, you know, want violence or actively want to hurt people in any way, and that doesn't matter whether or not you are Jewish or another person from another group that is like me or isn't like me. Peace is much, much more powerful. Democracy is more powerful. And so, as long as you're not, spewing hate speech and violence and violent words and rhetoric, call me wrong if I'm wrong. So, thank you, everybody. And as always, in case I don't see you, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.